So OU's, for my sins, I've been looking recently at how the College of Arts and Sciences describes its mission. And the Arts and Sciences College here boasts that it prepares its students for successful lives by advancing their personal and intellectual growth through a 21st century liberal arts education. What distinguishes a 21st century liberal arts education from its earlier variants is left surely deliberately vague. But I suspect that we are to take that a 21st century liberal arts education is one that's supposed to be relevant to 21st century students' needs and interests. But the problem with using relevance as an educational criteria strikes me that one, it presupposes what actually is or isn't relevant, and two, that which is presupposed to be relevant is utilitarian at best and Philistine at worst. And surely most who hold up relevance as a criteria would think that ancient Rome and William Shakespeare are things which, though perhaps interesting in themselves, are wholly irrelevant to the 21st century. Mercifully, tonight's speaker, I think, would beg to differ. Paul Cantor is the Clifton Waller Barrett Professor of English at the University of Virginia, and he received both his BA and PhD from Harvard University, where he studied, among other people, with Harvey Mansfield. As a high school student in New York, he also studied with the noted economist Ludwig von Mises. He's the author of 7 books on a stunningly wide range of subjects, going from Shakespeare and Romanticism to Austrian economics and pop culture. And indeed, his scholarly interests are so staggeringly wide-ranging that I suspect he's one of the very few people who could pull off an essay entitled Cartman Shrugged, The Invisible Gnomes and Invisible Hand in South Park. He may indeed talk about South Park tonight, or a show that he and I have discovered that we have a mutual fondness for, Squidbillies. But the official thing he's talking about tonight is about his latest book from the University of Chicago Press, Shakespeare's Roman Trilogy, The Twilight of the Ancient World, which just appeared from the University of Chicago Press. And he's here tonight to talk about that book and on its relevance, if I can say that, to the American Republic. Professor Cantor visits us tonight as a guest of the George Washington Forum on American Ideas, Politics, and Institutions, and the Washington Forum operates thanks to private donations, not your student dollars. And I'm happy to say that tonight's talk is underwritten by generous donations to OU by alumni and staff, and by a grant from the Charles Koch Foundation. I want to thank them all for helping bring Cantor to OU. So his talk tonight is Shakespeare, Rome, and the American Republic, and I hope you'll join me in welcoming Paul Cantor to UVA, to OU. Sorry.
Thanks very much for that introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. I just finished a unit on Greek tragedy with my class back at the University of Virginia and told them I was going to Athens. They were so excited. I didn't tell them Ohio. But I've had a good experience here. I've been meeting with students. I've really enjoyed it. So, Rome. It's a fascinating subject. It's something we're still interested in. On the History Channel, I believe the 3 most popular subjects are Hitler, ancient Egypt, and ancient aliens, but 4th would be Rome. But I don't think we're paying sufficient attention to Rome, despite the fact that it makes up such a huge part of our civilization, and in the case of the United States, of our political heritage. We have something called the Senate in the United States, and that name is taken from Rome. We have a Chicago Tribune, and there was a time when there were more newspapers that were named the Tribunes because they fancied themselves as the representatives of the common people. And so Rome was really integrated into our own institutions. The founding fathers had studied Roman history. In the Federalist Papers, there are many mentions of Roman precedents. And so in order to understand our very own nation, it's important to know the history of Rome and Roman institutions, and it's unfortunate that I think that's being lost sight of. And I'm here to say today that one of the ways of recapturing that knowledge is through Shakespeare. And I spent a good part of my career writing about Shakespeare's Roman plays. Both my first book and my most recent book are on the subject, and Shakespeare was fascinated by Rome. Of his tragedies, 4 of them are set in ancient Rome. Several of his comedies are based on Roman models. From what we know of high school curriculum in his day, Shakespeare would have read Latin quite well enough to read Ovid, to read Virgil, and much of his thinking is involved with Rome, and many of his best plays are on the subject. As I've studied him, I've become increasingly impressed with his knowledge of Rome, and particularly his knowledge of the politics of Rome. And I have the word republic in my title, and what I want to suggest particularly was that Shakespeare was very much interested in the republican form of government. That runs counter to many common opinions of Shakespeare. He lived under Queen Elizabeth, under a monarchy, and to our knowledge, he never got up in the street and protested against Queen Elizabeth's monarchy. And for generations, Shakespeare scholars have, I think, rather unconsciously assumed that Shakespeare must have been pro-monarchy. In fact, I'm going to suggest he was very interested in the Republican alternative in government, as were many of his contemporaries. The people who claim no one was interested in republics around 1600 England have to deal with the curious fact that by 1649, England was a republic under Oliver Cromwell. Not a very successful one, it didn't last very long, but someone in England knew what a republic was for a whole republic to be created when the monarchy was overthrown under Charles I. And I'm not saying Shakespeare was calling for the overthrow of the British monarchy. At most, I'll claim he was hoping to see it reformed in the direction of the Roman Republic. But what I am saying is that he shows an unusual interest in republics in his plays. Two of his plays are set in Venice, Othello and Merchant of Venice. And Venice was the great example, along with Florence, of the revival of republican government in Renaissance Italy. And then when you turn to his Roman plays, he shows a peculiar interest in the Republican period. And that's what I'd like to sketch out for you today, and ultimately suggest its relevance to American government. That is, I'm going to deal with his three mature Roman plays, Coriolanus, Julius Caesar, and Antony and Cleopatra. I'm going to, for the moment, dismiss Titus Andronicus, which is there's a very good movie of it with Anthony Hopkins, but it's not one of Shakespeare's best plays, and was written very early and perhaps in collaboration with another author. But Julius Caesar, this is written maybe around 1599, 1600. Coriolanus and Antony and Cleopatra written around 1607, 08. They form, I believe, a trilogy. And you can see that when you order them according to historical order, which would mean not the order of composition, but the order of history, where Coriolanus would come first, Julius Caesar second, and Antony and Cleopatra third. And what I observed about that disposition is it focuses on the great issue of Roman history, namely republic versus empire. In order to understand Rome, we have to understand that it had two, at least, major phases in its history. The era of the Republic, which lasted very roughly from about 500 BC to 50 BC, or a little later, and then the Empire, which really begins under Octavius Caesar and then lasts, in one reckoning or another, to the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century AD. And these were very different eras, and our image of Rome is complicated because of these different eras. Sometimes when we think of Rome, we think of orgies, we think of decadence, we think of corrupt emperors, and that is the empire. We think of Nero, we think of Caligula. But sometimes when we think of Rome, we think of these incredible Roman legions, these disciplined armies that went on forced marches and conquered everybody. That's largely the era of the Republic. And Shakespeare, I think, was particularly interested in the impact on Roman life of living either under a republican form of government or an imperial form of government. So in these three plays, Coriolanus takes place essentially at the founding of the Roman Republic. Rome had been ruled by foreign kings, and Etruscan dynasty, the Tarquins, ruled tyrannically, and after years of oppression, the Romans kicked out these Tarquin kings, and they founded a republic, and above all, they never wanted a king again. And that was the foundation of the republic, and Coriolanus deals with a very specific moment when the common people are rebelling and they get tribunes to represent them. To many people, as I'll explain in a minute, that was what was most characteristic of the republic. So the Coriolanus deals with the founding of the republic. Julius Caesar deals with its end. When Julius Caesar is about to become, in effect, the first emperor of Rome, he's assassinated by conspiracy that wishes to restore the republic, but they fail. And that then leads to the empire, which in effect Shakespeare shows founded in Antony and Cleopatra. Now again, we're not yet at the official moment when Octavius Caesar became Augustus Caesar, and you can talk about the beginning of the line of Roman emperors, but Shakespeare shows how much was in place. In a way, he shows in Antony and Cleopatra what the empire was going to be like. And indeed, he exaggerates to some extent how transformed Rome was by the time of Antony and Cleopatra. So, if you just go by what Shakespeare deals with in these plays, he seems to focus them on this issue of republic versus empire, showing the founding of the republic in Coriolanus, in effect, the last gasp of the republic in Julius Caesar, and the emergence of the empire in Antony and Cleopatra. I have found that a very profitable way to read these plays. So let me now go through them quickly and to suggest what the issue is here. And broadly speaking, it's the difference between citizens and subjects. When Shakespeare looked at the Republic, what he admired about it was that it produced citizens. And what disturbed him about the empire was it produced subjects. That the Romans in the Republic are free and participate in politics and have a say in their own destiny. Now, this is not a democracy in any modern sense. He didn't think that the common people participated equally in Roman politics, but the point is they had a share. And that's what we see them getting in Coriolanus. They get these tribunes to represent them, and the tribunes were powerful. They, in effect, could veto anything the Senate passed. As we see in the play, they're able to get the most prominent military leader of Rome banished. And Shakespeare is very interested in what a community is like, where people are actively involved in their political life. Contrasting, he shows in the empire what happens when one man becomes Caesar, and no one else is going to share power with him, at least officially, and where people devolve into the passive subjects of an imperial rule. To me, that's the broader movement of these plays, from citizens to subjects. So, Shakespeare shows in Coriolanus a remarkable understanding of the classical republican regime. It was understood as a mixed regime in antiquity, and that means that it had a combination of monarchical, aristocratic, and democratic elements. The monarchical element was in the institution of the consuls. In the classic era of the Republic, Rome was ruled by two consuls. In a way, you see the new principle of the Republic right there. The great hostility in Rome was to one-man rule. They'd experienced that under the Tarquin kings. They didn't like the results. And so the idea was to have executive power vested in two men. And they had to agree on major decisions. And moreover, they served only 1 year. And they could not replace themselves, the ultimate term limits. And this meant that there was quite a turnover. in the number of people who occupied the office of consul. One consul always checked the other. There were limits to their terms. You can see here the emergence of two things that are very important to the American Republic: checks and balances and separation of powers. The Roman Republic was theorized as such in political theory, culminating in Machiavelli's discourses on the first 10 books of Livy, which Shakespeare may well have known. So you have a situation in which it wasn't like America where anyone can dream of growing up to be president. The common people in Rome did not have a reasonable expectation of becoming consuls. But of the body of the nobles, the patricians, a lot of people got to be consul. At the same time, you had this aristocratic element in the regime, the Senate, which consisted of the wealthy landowning families, and they deliberated on Roman policy. The consuls executed it and were fundamentally commanders in war. And then you had this tribunate where the people were able to choose a varying number, but usually 10, in Shakespeare it's just 2, of men from the plebeians who would represent their interests. And again, this is not representative democracy, and the people running the city were not chosen by the common people, but they did have a veto. The nominee for the consulship had to be approved by the common people. And Coriolanus in Shakespeare's plays runs the worst political campaign in history, in that he manages to offend all the people when he's trying to get their vote. When they ask him what has brought you here, he says, "Mine own desert, not mine own desire." He's a little too arrogant with the people, and they throw him out of Rome. It's actually amazing that this Roman regime functioned. It looks so jerry-built and ramshackle, and yet through separating powers, keeping checks and balances, it did mean that the Roman Republic was successfully governed. You want to say, what an awful regime, what a mess of a regime, and look at this disaster, look at that disaster. It did last, however, for over 450 years. So there must have been something right about it. And I think Shakespeare is showing that in Coriolanus, that here, and even in the face of a deep crisis where Coriolanus is banished and goes over and leads the enemies of the Romans against him, his family, and specifically his mother, is able to appeal enough to his Roman patriotism to give up his attack on Rome, and the city does prevail. And I think Shakespeare is very interested in showing the power of this kind of small city. And again, Rome started as a very small city in the ancient sense, and the way this small community was able to bring its weight to bear on its citizens to shape them into Romans. Said at one point in the play, it is held that valor is the chiefest virtue. Shakespeare was interested, how did Rome become so successful in conquering the Mediterranean world? You can see it in Coriolanus and the nature of the Roman army and its leaders. And also, Shakespeare is very interested in what happens in a city with this kind of intense focus on political life, where there are really not alternatives. For example, Shakespeare is very careful to exclude any ideas of an afterlife in Coriolanus, even though there are some indications in his sources of Roman beliefs in an afterlife. He wants to show a world in which the only form of immortality is fame, and in which someone who wants to become immortal does it by winning great military victories for Rome. And throughout so much of Roman history, that was the case. And in a way, I think Shakespeare went back to Coriolanus. It's very unusual that he wrote about this play. Very few artists before or since have regarded this as a fruitful artistic subject, and to be honest, it has not turned out to be one of Shakespeare's more popular plays, but I think it was really a kind of thought experiment for him. Let's look at a community that is narrowly and tightly focused on political life, in which fulfillment comes only through political life, and in which achieving something for your community, for your city, is the highest goal in life. And the result is Roman history and the ability of this Republican community to defeat all comers, and in the few cases where it suffered defeat, to bounce back and annihilate its opposition eventually. And I think in looking at these Roman plays, Shakespeare is very, very aware of what we would call trade-offs. That this community is very powerful as a political community. It really produces what was thought of as the classical Republican virtues of people who are strong and independent, courageous, willing to fight for their community, tremendous sense of community in these plays. On the other hand, it is a very narrow way of life. And it's quite striking in Coriolanus for Shakespeare. There's no love. There's no romantic love in the play. No Romeos and Juliets in the Rome of Coriolanus. No Antony and Cleopatras in the Rome of Coriolanus. Coriolanus addresses his wife, and he does have a wife, but he addresses her as my gracious silence. And there's no big love duets in Coriolanus, as there are, of course, in Romeo and Juliet and even in Antony and Cleopatra. And I think Shakespeare is really showing a trade-off here. If you want this kind of community devoted to political life, it's going to lack other things. There's no poetry in the play. There are no beautiful lyrical passages that we associate with Shakespeare. So let's fast forward to Julius Caesar. And there we see a threat now to this Republican way of life, and above all to the notion of no one-man rule in Rome. What's happened is that the Republic is, in a way, a victim of its own success. It has by now conquered much of the Mediterranean world, and it now has these great conquerors, men like Pompey the Great, Julius Caesar. They have been leading their legions for 5-10 years. The armies have become loyal to them personally and not so much to Rome anymore. They've become fabulously wealthy. They can use that money to corrupt Roman politics and ensure the election of their cronies to offices within Rome. And Caesar has outdone all his competitors. He's chased Pompey to his death. There's really no one to rival him. And this is now the great threat perceived by the partisans of the old republic, notably Cassius, who organizes the conspiracy against Caesar and who complains to Brutus, when the hell was there only one man in Rome before? He puts it a little better than that. But basically that speech in Act 1 where he just, okay, Caesar's impressive, but he's still a man. I once saved him from drowning. I once saw him have a fever. He's just another human being, but he's like a god now. At one point, Cassius famously says to Brutus, "The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves that we are underlings." And that's the spirit of the Roman Republic there. We should be responsible for our lives. We should take our political destiny in our own hands. It's not the stars. It's not soothsayers. It's not people who predict the future. The future is to be determined by us, the Roman senators. And Cassius is ashamed that one man has grown so great in Rome that he's toying with becoming king. He's had Mark Antony stage this trial balloon of offering Caesar a crown in public to see if the crowd will accept it. Now they don't. It's like they would accept anything but the name of king. They'll let Caesar be dictator for life, which he was at that point already, but they're not yet ready to make him king. And so the conspiracy forms in this effort to save the old principle of the Republic and to reestablish the autonomy of these Roman, at least the patricians, that they can have a say in ruling their city. It's a great question whether Shakespeare thought the Republic could be saved. There are many suggestions in the play that it couldn't be. The most painful moment, in a way, comes when Brutus is trying to defend the murder of Caesar, and the crowd is with him, but what they say is, "Let him be Caesar." That's when you know it's over, it seems like, that these people want to be ruled by one man. In fact, it's one of the ironies of the play that Caesar becomes a higher title than king in the play. Caesar was just the name of this man, Julius Caesar, but it has passed into our language to mean emperor, and in German it's Kaiser, in Russian it's Tsar. The name Caesar has become a higher title than king, and we can see that happening in the play. Now, it's clear that the conspiracy makes a number of mistakes, the most famous one being allowing Mark Antony to speak at Caesar's funeral. If they make mistakes, it suggests that they could have done something different and the outcome would have been different. So I think Shakespeare actually leaves it ambiguous, and it is one of the great questions of history. Could the Republic have been saved? Had it been so corrupted by its own foreign conquests and its new wealth that one-man rule had become inevitable? I know historians have not been able to settle that issue. I don't think Shakespeare settles it in a way. I think he leaves it open. But in any case, we do see what happens in that the conspiracy fails, and by the end of the play, the great representatives of the Republic, Cassius and Brutus, are both dead. The Caesarian party, what they want is what later was referred to as bread and circuses. We see it when Mark Antony finds in Caesar's will a clause that will donate 75 drachmas to each plebeian. That's the price of freedom. They're willing to sell their free birthright as Romans for 75 drachmas, and indeed they effectively vote themselves out of history. The plebeians are very active in the action in Coriolanus. They succeed in banishing him, and in Julius Caesar, they are in effect the factor determining who wins the conflict between the Caesar party and the Republic party. We get this contest of speeches between Brutus and Mark Antony, and the people vote for Mark Antony. But in that moment, they vote themselves out of history. They never appear again in the Roman plays. I've never seen anyone note this fact. But in Acts 4 and 5 in Julius Caesar and in all of Antony and Cleopatra, the plebeians never appear on stage again after having had significant roles in Coriolanus and the first 3 acts of Julius Caesar. And they actually do. They vote themselves out of history. They're saying, okay, a Caesar's going to run our lives now, and as long as we get the 75 drachmas and we get entertained and we get bread, we're fine with this. And that's what I'm talking about when I say Shakespeare sees how people become subjects in an imperial regime and give up their ambition and the Republican virtues. Now, there are compensations for this. Again, a trade-off. The Rome of Julius Caesar is corrupt by the political standards of Coriolanus, but corruption has its own virtues. And for example, the love between man and woman has become more significant in the Rome of Julius Caesar. We see Brutus and Portia, a married couple. We see Julius Caesar and Calpurnia. And they're not exactly Romeo and Juliet either, but we've come a long way from Coriolanus and Virgilia, and there's total silence about their love. Calpurnia expresses a concern about Julius Caesar. Brutus and Portia are portrayed as man and wife and what we would call a loving couple. There are many other touches in Rome that show there's been a positive side to the change since the Republic. One thing I noted in my new book is the Hellenization of the Rome of Julius Caesar. There's the famous moment when Cassius asked Casca what Cicero just said after that trial balloon with the crown and Caesar. And Casca famously says, but as to what Caesar said, I know that 'tis Greek to me. And it did dawn on me, there's a lot of people who speak Greek in the Rome of Julius Caesar, and a lot of Greek philosophy. Brutus is a Stoic, Cassius is an Epicurean, there's a cynic that shows up, Cicero is an academic or an academic skeptic. And you really see what was historically true, that by the time of Julius Caesar, Rome had been remade in many ways by its encounter with Greece. And young Romans were being sent to study in Athens. Poor Ovid wanted to be a poet, and his parents sent him to law school in Athens instead, but he ended up a poet anyway. And then he got banished from Rome by Augustus. But you see whole dimensions in life that were closed off in Coriolanus that are being opened up. There's a new interest in philosophy in Rome. There were no philosophers in the Rome of Coriolanus. There are these soothsayers around the city. There's people who are claiming to have some vision of the divine that is not defined for them by the city. Though in many ways Rome has lost its focus on politics, its Republican virtue, there are compensations for that. And that then leads me to Antony and Cleopatra, which shows how changed the regime is now. Now again, we're not officially in the Roman Empire yet. The Battle of Actium is 31 BC. Octavius, I think, isn't proclaimed Augustus Caesar until 27 BC. But essentially, the empire is in place. We start off with still this triumvirate of Lepidus, Octavius Caesar, and Mark Antony. Then they eliminate Lepidus, and then Mark Antony dies by the end of the play. And we see the consequences of one-man rule. And it's nice to contrast it with the institution of the consuls. In the Republic, you had two rulers at the top, and they changed every year. That meant the city never became too dependent on any one man. There were always people around who'd been consul before, able to speak up to that effect. At one point, I think it's Cominius who says in Coriolanus, I have been consul, and listen to me. But now you got one emperor with supposedly lifetime tenure. Didn't work out that well for many of the emperors. There's the famous year of 4 emperors in Rome. But that's the point. There was now no legitimate way of changing emperors. So in fact, assassination became a very common feature of political life in the empire. And we see that in Antony and Cleopatra when Sextus Pompeius is offered the chance to actually kill Lepidus, Antony, and Octavius and become the ruler of Rome. But he turns that down. He has cold feet about that. But we see the consequences now. There's only one man at the top and no clear turnover. And so, in fact, a lot of people turn away from politics. Now, Cleopatra was this incredibly seductive woman, and it's very possible that even in the era of the Republic, she could have seduced a Roman general away. But that's not clear. We'll never know what would have happened if Coriolanus had met Cleopatra. I think there are very strong signs in the play that Mark Antony is disillusioned with politics. And that's the reason why he's so attracted to Cleopatra. In Julius Caesar, he's faced with the death of his great hero. And then there's that moment when he sees the mangled dead body of Caesar, when he says, O mighty Caesar, hath thou sunk so low, or all thy conquests, glories, triumphs, shrunk to this little measure. That's a speech about disillusionment with politics. He's the greatest man ever in political life in Rome, and he ended up butchered. And that has a deep effect on Antony. In fact, he says to the conspirators at that point, kill me right now. Kill me. This is the moment I want to die. I could live 1,000 years and I'll never have a better moment than to die with my master here. And they don't kill him. And he has to live with the thought that in a way he betrayed the memory of his master. He pulls himself together to achieve his revenge on the conspirators. But I think he's never able to look at politics the same way again. And so when Cleopatra comes along, here's another way to immortality. When we see them at the beginning of the play, Cleopatra is basically, how much do you love me? And they're saying there's no limits to our love. And to find the limits to our love, you'd have to find out new heaven, new earth. And Antony proclaims, he kisses Cleopatra and says, the nobleness of life is to do thus. As he's redefining Roman nobility. So Roman nobility in politics looks tarnished at this point. Cleopatra says at one point, "'Tis paltry to be Caesar." The whole Roman goal, the whole Roman ambition, being a glorious leader, has been tainted by the corruption already of imperial rule. And so you see in Antony and Cleopatra that they're seeking out another form of greatness, another form of immortality, their immortality as lovers. And all the things that are totally absent in Coriolanus and still relatively absent in Julius Caesar flood into Antony and Cleopatra, one of the greatest love stories ever written, a play filled with these great love duets and all this lyrical love poetry. And so again, as what looks like corruption in terms of the old Republican virtues and political life now suddenly takes on this new glory. There's suddenly a whole realm of private life, of romance, that is the new source of achievement for people. It's very convenient for the Roman emperors to see people divert from politics into love. Julius Caesar recognized that in his famous speech when he says to Antony, "Yon Cassius has a lean and hungry look. Such men are dangerous. Yeah, let me have men about me that are fat," Julius Caesar says, which sounds a little strange for recruiting for your regime, but the idea if someone's fat, they eat a lot, they party, and they don't worry about who's governing them. In a way, Antony and Cleopatra is the portrayal of a fat world, the world of bread and circuses, the world where people are enjoying life, they're indulging themselves, one banquet after another in Antony and Cleopatra, and not really among the Egyptians, but the Romans themselves. They're invoking Bacchus, they're getting drunk, even Octavius Caesar gets drunk. And it's a fascinating study in the way private life changes with the different political regime, how the Romans are no longer being shaped on the Republican model. And it's the trouble for Antony's soldiers. They are loyal to him. He's a great hero, their leader in many battles, but he doesn't seem to want to win anymore. He seems to throw away battles for the sake of Cleopatra. And again, it at first looks like just infatuation, but I think it goes deeper than that, and that Shakespeare is portraying a kind of spiritual emptiness in Antony that flows from his disillusionment with political life, as represented by the fact of Caesar's death, and that all of Caesar's great political achievements seem to come to naught for him. And Shakespeare shows this in a number of the subordinate characters in the play. A particularly interesting scene that's usually omitted from productions, Act 3, Scene 1, where a Roman captain named Ventidius is on the frontier. He's just defeated the Parthians, the last of Rome's great enemies in the east, the Parthians who had defeated the great Marcus Crassus, one of the most humiliating defeats the Romans ever suffered, and here the Romans have finally avenged that. And somebody asked Ventidius, well, why don't you pursue this? Why don't you go conquer further in the east? You'll get a triumph in Rome, you'll be a hero. And he says, a lower place may make too great an act. he realizes that Antony will get suspicious of him if Ventidius is too ambitious. Antony will worry that Ventidius is trying to replace Antony. Now remember, under the old Republican system, Antony may have been the sitting consul. Ventidius would win a victory, he'd be the next consul. He wouldn't have to kill Antony in the Republic in order to become consul. But in the emerging world of the empire, that's what you have to do. So in fact, it's even said, Coriolanus, there's a conversation among the tribunes in which they are surprised that Coriolanus is willing to accept second in command in a war. And they say, well, wait a minute, that's really the advantageous spot. If the army goes wrong and is defeated, they'll blame the guy in charge, but if Coriolanus wins a battle, he'll get all the credit. In the world of the empire, that's completely reversed. Ventidius says, if I win this battle, Antony will get the credit, and moreover, he'll think I'm trying to replace him, so I won't do too much. And he says, I'll make choice of loss. He says the incredible lines, ambition, the soldier's virtue, rather makes choice of loss than gain which darkens him. And that's quite extraordinary that under the empire, the Roman principle has become choice of loss. You never see that in the Republic. Choice of victory was the Republican principle of victory or death. And Shakespeare shows in Antony and Cleopatra a remarkable process in which terms are getting redefined. Defeat is becoming victory, weakness is becoming strength, death is becoming life. At the end of the play, Octavius Caesar, observing Cleopatra, says, "Oh, excellent, oh, noble weakness." Very, very strange for Roman vocabulary, that weakness is noble. But it's all the consequence of an empire which can no longer tolerate the kind of strength and ambitiousness that the Republic channeled into political life through this variety of institutions that made that possible. And again, it's a kind of trade-off, because there's all sorts of things that are developing in the empire that are admirable and allow certain aspects of human nature to flourish in a way they could not in the Republic. But I think Shakespeare is tragic. People often forget that he is fundamentally a tragic writer, that he sees that not everything is possible at all times and in all places. That the kind of man Coriolanus was, which is not a very nice man, but an incredibly powerful warrior, was possible only in this Roman Republic where valor is held to be the chiefest virtue. By the time of Antony and Cleopatra, valor is no longer held to be the chiefest virtue. The nobleness of life is to do thus, as Antony gives Cleopatra a big smackaroo on the lips and shows off his love to all the world. So again, I think it's one reason Shakespeare is tragic, that he sees this trade-off, and that to make certain human possibilities an option, you have to close off other ones. And again, he was very interested in the empire as well. He sees how modern Europe grew out of the Roman Empire, and you can see signs of that in Antony and Cleopatra. But on the other hand, he's very aware of what was lost, and this was very much part of thinking in the Renaissance. Renaissance means rebirth, and what was reborn was classical antiquity. And he saw it quite concretely in Renaissance Italy, where, among other things, cities like Florence and Venice revived the Republican form of government and flourished very well under Republican forms of government, though there was a lot of strife in the cities as well. And I think Shakespeare was very interested in that development. Again, he wrote 2 plays about Venice. Is interested in what does this mean, the recovery of this old form of political participation and these Republican virtues. And I think he was applying them to his own time. Now again, he did not go out with a banner in the streets of London saying, "Republic now, down with Elizabeth." That would have been suicide. But I think in these plays he was trying to show, in a true Renaissance spirit, what the ancient alternative to the monarchical regime was, and how it was being revived in Venice. He was particularly interested in this new notion of the commercial republic and what the rule of law might play in that. And so his history plays are constantly filled with references to Rome. In Henry V, for example, the chorus that opens Act 5, Henry is returning from his great victory at the Battle of Agincourt, and Shakespeare has the chorus compare this to a Roman Caesar returning in triumph to Rome. And there it is right there, that he is modeling his English monarch, his greatest English monarch, Henry V, on a conquering Roman hero. And then he throws in this amazing reference where he says, as would our general coming back from Ireland might. And that is almost certainly a reference to the Earl of Essex, who was in some ways the most ambitious noble in Elizabeth's court, and who had been sent to Ireland to put down troubles there. He failed at it and eventually led to his political downfall. He actually attempted a kind of coup against Elizabeth, which failed miserably. Shakespeare would not have known that when he wrote that line, because he surely wouldn't have written it if he did. But there's an amazing moment where Shakespeare's comparing a moment in ancient Roman history, older British history, and a contemporary moment, and he sees a continuity there of these great noble captains who win victories for their nations. And I think this would be very controversial as a claim, but I think that in a play like Henry V, Shakespeare is suggesting that without overthrowing the British monarchy, you might remodel it, adopting some of the principles of the Roman Republic. I think Shakespeare's hope for England was that while maintaining a monarchy, it might develop this same kind of separation and balance of powers in Rome, so that what Henry reflects in Shakespeare's view is a king who very much takes into account the interests of his nobles and of the common people. Again, in Machiavelli's understanding and other understandings of the ancient Roman regime, that was what was striking about the Roman Republic, that it incorporated the energies of the common people in the regime. Again, not in the sense of modern representative democracy, but still in the sense that the people have a role in the regime. And that's what Shakespeare shows about Henry V. He goes out of his way, tells the whole story of his life in Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, and then in Henry V. And what he shows about this man is that he was in touch with his people. At first, everyone thinks he's a bum. Instead of hanging out at court, he's down in the taverns drinking with a bunch of lowlives who are highwaymen. And yet what Henry reports is, I can drink with any tinker in his own language. I mean, he is mixed among his common people. He knows their slang, and that really becomes important when he's a king, when he can give speeches to the common people, inspire them when they're soldiers in his army, be a leader, take them into account. And Shakespeare shows these scenes on the eve of the Battle of Agincourt. He actually does a great job of contrasting the French. The French are all these nobles. They're writing sonnets to their mistresses or to their horses. They have no idea who their common people are. They all ride into battle like Sir Lancelot and get mowed down by an English citizen army, inspired by Henry V, who gets the people on his side because of what's called a little touch of Harry in the night. He has the common touch. And again, Shakespeare's not asking for a modern democracy, but he is trying to teach the kings of England to have a regard for the common people, move among them, know what they're thinking, learn their language. And of course, Henry also does a wonderful job of keeping the nobles on his side. At the beginning of Henry V, there's a conspiracy among the nobles to kill him, and he's figured out this strategy. I'll lead them in a war to reclaim our rights in France, and I'll reward all the nobles. I'll reward everybody. In his famous speech, the St. Christmas Day speech, he says, "This day shall each man shall gentle his condition." It means everybody's going to move up a rank or so in the hierarchy. So again, without saying that Shakespeare wanted a republic in England, for example, I'm pretty sure he would not have supported Oliver Cromwell, because the first thing Cromwell did was to shut down the theaters. But I do think he hoped that England might develop a more moderate kingship, again, to some extent modeled on the mixed regime of the Roman Republic. And I don't want to overestimate Shakespeare's influence, but I don't want to underestimate it either. And England did develop a more moderate kingship than, say, the French or several of the continental regimes. And there's still a monarch on the English throne last time I looked. Whereas the French kings are long since gone. And it may well be that Shakespeare had a role in reshaping the conception of monarchy. After all, in his day, the Stuarts were moving towards a more absolute conception of monarchy than even under the Tudors, and that's what led to Cromwell and the Puritan Revolution. But by the 18th century, the British regime was being moderated. By the 18th century, no less than Baron Montesquieu said, England is a republic masquerading as a monarchy. And indeed, that's the way we would look at it today, a parliamentary monarchy. Really, Parliament rules England. And I think, again, Shakespeare was not in a position to bring about this result single-handedly, but I believe these plays, whole generations of English people grew up on them, and I think they did have a moderating effect. And so it would be even more of a stretch to say that Shakespeare created the American regime. But again, through the channeling of the English regime, I would not underestimate his effects. And above all, the fact I do believe he has served as one of the great channels of Roman history to the modern world, that in some ways they are the culmination of the Renaissance, his recreation of the ancient Roman world, at least on the stage. And these principles I began talking about, and again, separation of powers and checks and balances in the government in very different forms, they are there in our Constitution. And again, if you look at the Federalist Papers, you can see that Madison and Hamilton said they were thinking in terms of Roman precedents. And so I think we, again, it's kind of a tough sell now to get people to study Roman history. I'm trying to suggest a great way of doing it is by reading Shakespeare's Roman plays, which I think have captured a great deal of Roman history accurately, and they also do serve as a warning that regimes don't last forever. Again, whenever people criticize the Roman Republic, I say, well, it did last 450 years. The American regime isn't that old yet, and who knows if it's going to last 450 years total in a recognizable form. And one of the great themes of Shakespeare's Roman plays is the corruption of a regime, and in particular, the way the pursuit of empire and foreign victories can end up coming back to haunt a regime by subjecting it to corrupting foreign influences, by corrupting its domestic politics. Again, I'm not here to draw direct parallels between anything in Shakespeare's plays or actual Roman history and contemporary events in the United States, but I do think it's sobering to reflect on the story that Shakespeare tells in these Roman plays. And above, I like to call it the tragedy of the Roman Republic, the rise and fall of the Roman Republic, and he really does quite an acute analysis of that. So let me leave it at that. I would love to take questions from you about any of this. A little applause is nice too. Here's the cover of the new book, by the way. Great cover. You can come up and see it afterwards. don't have copies to sell. But it's available on Amazon. Anyway, questions? Yes?
How would you contrast the fantasy republic sketched out in the Tempest, for example?
Well, as long as you asked, I believe that's based on Plato's Republic, and that it is it's a utopian play in the deepest Platonic sense of utopia, that Shakespeare is looking at what the best regime might be, knowing that it's impossible or very, very improbable. And so it's kind of the obvious point that Plato makes: the best regime is when the wise man rules. It's, of course, always a problem to find the wise man, but there's a certain sense that if you really knew who the wise man is, he should rule. And so I see Prospero as a kind of philosopher king. And this, I've written on this, and but I'll just say very quickly that it's the Platonic analysis of the soul, that Caliban is Eros and Ariel is Thumos, and it's very complicated, but I haven't worked it out. But it's basically showing Prospero has learned how to rule, and like a Platonic philosopher king, has to be forced to, and what we see is he's able to rule these ordinary human beings by playing off one part of their soul against another. Anyway, I got 2 essays on that and a bunch of lectures on YouTube. But you know, essentially I would say that there's a deep Platonic strain in Shakespeare, I think, and I think the Tempest manifests that. Yeah.
I appreciated your comments about Henry V and his affinity for the common man that we see with Prince Hal. What though would we do with the complication of his rejection of Falstaff at the end? He seems to maybe take some of those Republican virtues, and it seems somewhat Machiavellian.
He is more than somewhat Machiavellian. He's very Machiavellian, but, you know, he learns a great deal from Falstaff. He learns to appreciate the common man by dealing with this example of it. It's one thing to learn from him. It's another thing to make him your chief of staff or put him in the White House. And that's what Henry understands. And if you look carefully, Falstaff's offered a deal. As you reform yourself, you can come back. Everyone is waiting for Henry to just go carousing with Falstaff, and it would be a public relations disaster. And of course, Falstaff pushes the point, wants to make it in public, and so Henry does what he has to do, but very careful instructions. As you reform yourself, you know, just cool it, see you in about a year, you know, we'll meet in private. He has to reject Falstaff because Falstaff has punched out the Lord High Justice and shown that he's going to suspend the laws if he comes into power. So, and by the way, Falstaff is Sir John Falstaff. He's not a common man. So it's very complicated. It shows that you can't treat him in public the way he wants to be treated. Now, this gets much deeper because Falstaff's also Socrates. And this is a complicated thing, but Shakespeare has Falstaff quote Socrates at one point. This, you'd have to really get into this. And so it is that, against this point that you cannot let your predilection for philosophy be understood by the common people. And it's actually fascinating. Falstaff's death is described exactly like Socrates' death in the Phaedo. Dies from the feet up. It's really interesting to see the elements of Socrates and Falstaff. So again, Shakespeare is very interested in this idea of the philosopher king, and it shows up, and in fact it's said of Henry V at the beginning of the play that he's as good in theory as in practice. So that's a deeper level of the play than would be evident to the audience. So, dragging me down to the depths here.
So you've talked, when you were talking to plays, different regimes require different spirits, require different spirits.
And also shape them.
And shape them as well. So you ended up, thought experiment on the American Republic. What is the spirit, right, of of that republic, this republic?
Well, that's very complicated, but I will say what's distinctive is that commercial element. And if you, in some ways in The Merchant of Venice, Shakespeare is coming closest to studying America, where there's this odd combination of the rule of law, supposedly religious tolerance, and a commercial spirit. A lot of the elements that you see in John Locke are turning up in The Merchant of Venice, though Shakespeare is not as confident about putting them together and is really quite worried about it. But, you know, America is a hybrid. I mean, there is this classical Republican tradition and great admiration for Roman virtue. When you know, Cato, I think Addison's Cato was the most popular play in 18th century America. A lot of that has been lost, but you know, you still see it on our public buildings, built in classical form. So I think there's a strong element of that, but obviously what is distinctive is the modernity of the American regime, and that is more Locke and Adam Smith and the commercial spirit, and that changes things. In some ways it lowers the tone of things and kind of dilutes the nobility of it, but it has its own kind of nobility. We use the language of nobility to, you know, we speak of robber barons, for example. They're robbers, but they're barons. So there's a sense of the new aristocracy in America. I mean, the accumulation of wealth has been more important to the United States than it was, at least nominally, in the Roman Republic and so on. So, but you know, the commercial spirit, and I think Shakespeare understood this in Merchant of Venice, goes along with a certain toleration. Now, it doesn't fully work out in Merchant of Venice, but there's that moment when I think it's Shylock says about, or is it Antonio said, if you lend this money, lend it not as to a friend. The amazing thing about a commercial republic is it doesn't depend upon these tribal affinities and these ethnic affinities, and supposedly the motive of the marketplace is you deal with everybody equally in a commercial transaction. And Shakespeare's interested in that. He noticed that about Venice, and how it's an amazing way in which economics could moderate the old religious strife. So, for example, as this comic moment when the Lancelot Gobbo, the comedian, says, "Oh, don't convert them to Christianity. It'll raise the price of pork in Venice. As long as we have enough Jews, they're not eating pork, so we don't have to outbid them." And that's funny, but there's a profound truth in that. That their commerce cuts across religious differences. So it's, you know, it's the nature of where the United States comes from that we're late in history, and so draw upon you know, both the classical tradition, the Christian tradition, the modern philosophical tradition, again Hobbes and Locke and Montesquieu, and who first were theorizing this new possibility of the commercial republic exactly as a way of ending the terrible religious strife of the 17th century and finding a new basis for community in commerce. And again, that gets theorized by the Scottish Enlightenment, and you see in Adam Smith and Adam Ferguson and all these new hopes, which in many respects have been realized in the United States, but with many problematic aspects to them as well, and to some extent a lowering in the sights of what human beings can be. And I think that was Shakespeare's worry in Merchant of Venice, I think, as he looked at Venice, that commerce might crowd out by these higher considerations. But those are big questions. Any little questions? No. It's been some of the biggest questions I've ever gotten. Come on, students, don't let the faculty show you up here. You're smarter than they are, show it. I mean, any questions about Shakespeare in general? I mean, it doesn't have, yes?
What's your favorite play?
Well, it is Coriolanus. But it's funny. I mean, I think King Lear is his greatest play, and therefore the greatest product of the human imagination. I think Hamlet's pretty good. Coriolanus is kind of like no one else likes it, so I like it. And I kind of like Coriolanus because he speaks his mind. And we spend most of our lives not saying what we really think about other people because we want to be nice. And Coriolanus doesn't want to be nice. So I kind of like him, but I'm in a small minority in that regard. Surely you must have some questions about Shakespeare. At lunch, students were asking me questions.
So can I use the moderators to ask the last one
Okay.
not about Shakespeare, but about Breaking Bad? So at lunch you were saying, right, that this was the great American show, right, and this captured something about the American Republic that was it had singular insight into America. What is it, and yeah,
Well, how many of you have seen Breaking Bad? Okay, that's pretty good. I think it's an American tragedy, and I think it's very similar to Macbeth. I've actually just written an essay called The Macbeth of Meth. Walter White is tragic hero. And what you really see in that work is a tragic tension between two aspects of the American dream, which we like to think of as in harmony, but very often end up in tension. On the one hand, the American dream is to have a family, to be, in this case, a good husband and father, to have a family, to provide for them, to protect them, and this very much ingrained in the American dream and was celebrated in decades of American situation comedies, Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best, My Three Sons, and so on. This is all ancient history to you guys. And then the other great American dream is Horatio Alger, the self-made man, make something of yourself, Thomas Edison, be the great inventor, achieve something, make a lot of money, change the world, and often the notions will blend these together. You're a self-made man for the sake of your family, that you will make all this money, you'll invent the better mousetrap for the sake of your family. And again, it would be wonderful for those two things to go together, and many American dream stories show that. But in fact, there's a real tension there, because to build that better mousetrap, you usually neglect your family. And so, you're working 14, 18 hours a day, whatever. And many of our dramas deal with that tension. I think Breaking Bad goes to the heart of that, in that Walter White, to some extent, fools himself that he goes into the meth business for the sake of his family. He's dying of cancer and wants to leave something for them, and in particular for his handicapped son. It works out tragically. The pursuit of wealth in this case, which again is in a criminal activity, but as comes out in the dialogue is not all that different. There's a dialogue between Walter and Hank, his DEA brother-in-law, where Hank is making beer and they're joking about back in Prohibition, you would have been a crook. And in a way, it suggests a certain arbitrariness to what is criminal and what is not criminal at a time. And so you really see in it a kind of tragic tension at the heart of the American dream between family and business. By the way, this is the great theme of The Godfather as well, which I'm also writing about in this book, and of many American stories. And in particular, what you see, what takes it deeper, as I see it, is that we come to understand that in fact Walter White was deeply unfulfilled as a family man. And here it's a great coincidence that Bryan Cranston, the actor who plays Walter White, also played Hal in Malcolm in the Middle. How many of you know Malcolm in the Middle? All right. It's the same character. That's the amazing thing. At the beginning of the series, Walter White is a henpecked husband, Skylar is his Lois, and they both go around in their underwear. And that's true. Even Bryan Cranston noted that. And he was perfect to play the part because the Walter White being the show is emasculated by his family situation. And though he claims he's working for his family, he discovers no, he's working for himself. And to do something well, he's this man of great chemistry talents who thinks he's being wasted in a high school chemistry class with students who only want to know if it's going to be on the exam. And he makes the best crystal meth in the world. Now, I'm not here advocating making crystal meth. But, you know, so if you're going to do it, you know, make the best. And he takes great pride in that. But it goes deeper than that, because the man has been a coward all his life. In every sense of the word, he lets himself be bullied by his students. He lets himself be bullied by his boss. He lets himself be bullied by his wife. He did not have the courage to stay in that high-tech investment. He could have been a billionaire if he'd stayed with the Schwartzes. It's never explained why he didn't, but I believe it was cowardice. People forget, people think it's really easy to be a high-tech Silicon Valley entrepreneur. It takes guts. And he liked it. And it turns out he's not a coward. He's an amazingly courageous person once his back is to the wall. And the great Shakespearean moment in the show is the speech, "I am the danger, I am the one that knocks." When you know, his wife is worried, you know, Gus has been killed and what's going on, and he says, "What are you worried about? I am the danger. I am the," he says, "you know, what happens if there's a knock at the door one night? I am the one that knocks." That's a great moment of Shakespearean tragic recognition when he is a hero. Now, he's a hero doing terrible things. But Macbeth does terrible things. Othello strangles his innocent wife. Coriolanus is a very nasty, nasty person and almost destroys Rome. And you can just go right down the list. Shakespearean heroes are not morally good, not the tragic heroes. By the way, Vince Gilligan, the creator, does not understand this. I've met him in a long conversation with him. I'd written an essay about the X-Files, and I got to talk to him, and he's a genius. Best show on television now is Better Call Saul, but so he doesn't quite understand. He said of the show, "I'm going to take Mr. Chips and turn him into Scarface." Well, Walter White is no Mr. Chips. You should all be spared having such a teacher who writes ridiculous on exam papers, or not even close, and who is incredibly sarcastic with his students, with good cause, I must say. And he doesn't end up as Scarface, because the guy never enjoys a moment of his life, never even tries his own meth, to my knowledge, unlike Scarface and his cocaine. Again, Gilligan's a genius, but he did not have the concept of tragic hero at his disposal. He thought only in terms of heroes and villains. That's why I do invoke Shakespeare here, that Shakespeare reminds us that there are people that do terrible things, but it makes them criminal. It doesn't say the whole truth about them then. And that's what's great about Shakespeare's plays. He can take a Macbeth and make him a sympathetic figure. And I think Gilligan makes Walter White a sympathetic figure. I was rooting for him to the very end. And the majority of my students say they were. Gilligan claims never to have understood that, and yet he was the one who created this sympathetic character. So that, for example, spoiler alert, Walter White's death is not the death of a simple criminal. He goes out killing some really, really bad people, saving his wife, providing for his daughter and son, saving Jesse. I mean, when you realize the alternatives Gilligan had for ending that show, I think he chose as noble a death as he possibly could have for Walter White. One reason I call it the greatest show ever is it's the only show that had a conclusion worthy to the whole show. I think The Sopranos really blew it in the conclusion. Deadwood never got to have a proper conclusion, and so on. So anyway, so I do think it's very helpful in understanding popular culture to remember there are heroes who aren't particularly nice people, who don't do particularly benevolent things, but manifest certain heroic qualities. And that's the point about Walter White goes from zero to hero in this sense, that a man who's wasted his talent all his life and has wasted, I believe, out of cowardice, that he won't take on these challenges. He lets himself become a high school chemistry teacher, and there's nothing wrong. I had a wonderful high school chemistry teacher named Mr. Barmash, and I still admire him, and he was very good to me. But the Walter White, in a certain sense, he fulfills himself as this drug king. And again, the truth is he really makes good meth, which in a limited sense is an achievement. And then all this courage. The first season, he and Jesse are such bumblers. They're the Three Stooges minus Curly in the first season. And then when you realize, and again, it's not just the cleverness of his schemes, but the daring and the courage of them. And when he finally admits to himself, I liked it. I did it because I liked it, because I like what I became. That's a very, to me, Shakespearean moment. So there's the Macbeth of meth for you. You have to wait for the next book for that.
If you'd like to ask, maybe after, let's give Professor Cantor.
Okay, I'll be happy to stick around. Thank you very much.